And welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our study of the Odyssey to Odyssey Book 4. Now this will of course finish what is sometimes referred to as the Telemachy, that four poems that kind of tell the story of Odysseus's Odyssey. This chapter for Fagles is called The King and Queen of Sparta. We in many ways think of it this way. We return to where it all started, right? I mean, this is the story of Helen and Menelaus in Paris revisited now 20 years later, right? In other words, everything has kind of happened the way it's happened. This is one of the really amazing books of the Odyssey because of the storytelling, the story within the story, if you want to tell it that way. We're getting ready for the major flashback story within the story that will be Odysseus' story, but we're kind of getting set up to it. And in many ways, let's put that in our notes. The first four books of the Odyssey, and many students struggle to appreciate this, because they're like, this is kind of boring stuff, and I thought this was a poem about Odysseus, and he's only being referenced over and over again. But what Homer is doing, and I think this is a brilliant way to kind of tell a story, is he's setting up the anticipation. So that when we finally see Odysseus for the first time in the next book, in Book 5, we're going to have all this back information that's going to inform our view of Odysseus, right? Now, really quickly, let's just review where we've been, okay? In Book 1 of Odyssey, we did the Invocation of the Muse. We talked about how Athena, in the Invocation of the Muse, we talked about how Odysseus is a man of twists and turns. We have Athena who shows up as Mentis on the island of Ithaca to help Telemachus, to give him his mission, and she tells him at line 340, it's time you grow up. And for the next three books, then this is what will happen, of course, and for the entire Odyssey, of course, Telemachus is growing up, culminating, of course, at the end, the final sequences there. In Book 2, we have Telemachus calling the assembly. He gets mocked. We have the famous eagle sign, the two eagles are fighting, and he leaves with Mentor, who is actually Athena. In Book 3, we have Telemachus on Pylos with Nestor, and there he is going to, Pisistratus is the son of Nestor. He's going to hang out with Pisistratus. They kind of become pals. We have Athena, who will be there as well as Mentor, and then she'll fly away as an eagle, and immediately Nestor realizes what's going on, and then Pisistratus and Telemachus will leave. Now again, the hope here is that you're reading on your own. I really would challenge you, if you haven't read for sure Book 4, sit down and read it. It's a wonderful, wonderful book to read, and then use what I'm saying here as kind of help, all right? The learning theory, again, we always emphasize is our desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, and we do that in our annotative approach by asking three guiding questions. At level 1, what does the text say? Summary. At level 2, what does the text mean? 2A, themes, messages. 2B, we're looking at the rhetoric, not what Homer says, but how he says it. And more particularly here at level 2B, we're looking at symbolism and irony. We're going to see a remarkable amount of that going on in this book. And finally, at level 3, we ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3A, relating it, first of all, to the Iliad and the other texts that I know, and then finally, how can I relate this to myself personally? How can I own the text? Let's do a real brief review of Odyssey 4. This will be the last, as we said, of the Telemachus books before we hit the end, right? First of all, we are at Menelaus' palace. Pisistratus and Telemachus will come in, and they come in immediately to double wedding. Okay, his daughter Hermines is getting married, as well as his son, not with Helen, but with another woman, with a slave woman, as well is being married off as well, Megapirthous. And both of the what's going on with the wedding? Well, right away, two things. We right away have, this is a palace with dynamic energy, and everything is forward-looking, and it's great. We have the example of Xenia right away, where Menelaus will take care of them. They feed Telemachus and Pisistratus, then tell stories about Odysseus, and Telemachus weeps. This is going to prefigure what's going to happen later on the island of the Phaeacians with Odysseus and Alcyoneus there, right? Helen shows up. It's a beautiful scene. I'm going to love talking about it with you. And she immediately recognizes Telemachus as Odysseus' son. In other words, in this poem, it seems that women recognize much sooner than do men, the male characters, what actually is going on, right? And as soon as she says it, Menelaus says, hey, you know what, you're right. Pisistratus will in fact be the one, not Telemachus, who says, this is Odysseus' son, you're absolutely right. Helen then does this really interesting thing, because they're sad, because they start talking about all the tragedies of Troy and all the losses. Of course, Menelaus lost his brother Agamemnon after the fall of Troy, right? Pisistratus lost his brother Alcyoneus as well at the walls of Troy, right? Helen drugs them, okay, so that they don't feel any pain. And then she tells an interesting story about Odysseus, how he got into the walls of Troy once as a beggar. And then Menelaus tells an even more remarkable story about how Helen knew that the Greek troops were inside of the Trojan horse, and she begins to call to these guys with the voices of their wives, and they want to respond, and it's Odysseus that keeps them from responding. It's an amazing moment, okay? Then after this one, they go to sleep. The next morning, Telemachus asks Menelaus, it's why he's there, what do you know about my dad? Menelaus tells this long story about being down in Egypt, getting information from Proteus, this shape changer guy, through the help of his daughter, and ultimately is told that Odysseus is on Calypso's island at line 558. Odysseus is alive and he's on Calypso's island. Well, he will say, right? Proteus then will tell Agamemnon's story to Menelaus, and Menelaus, of course, is brokenhearted that his brother has been killed by Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, right? Meanwhile, back on Ithaca, we come back to the suitors again, and Antonius, the bad guy, the lead bad guy, finds out that, in fact, Telemachus has left. He didn't know, and he wants to ambush him and kill him. Penelope finds out that Telemachus has left, and she is shattered, right? She falls down on the ground. She prays to Athena. At the very end of the book, she's visited through Athena with her sister's ghost, Iphithi, and we're going to have this really interesting exchange there, where two things are going to get said. Athena is taking care of Telemachus, and no, I don't know whether your husband is dead or alive, right? We end the Telemachus, the fourth book, with Telemachus about to set sail to come home, with the suitors sitting in the ocean, ready to attack, ambush, and kill him. Penelope worried about both son as well as obviously husband. And most importantly and interestingly, books 5 through books 14, we're not going to have anything about Telemachus other than Odysseus will reference him. We'll come back to Telemachus, we'll come back to the suitors, and of course we'll come back to the potential ambush and the escape that Athena will help proctor by book 15. All right, well, that's an overview. Now let's turn to this thing. Of all the books in the first 4 books that I love to read out loud, it is this one. But I'm going to fight that temptation and just go right to the heart of the matter. And so here we go. Menelaus, of course, has a palace. He has energy. He has dynamism. He has children who are being married off. In other words, let's put it in our notes. When the future looks bright for Menelaus and Helen, it does not look that way for Telemachus and Odysseus and obviously Penelope, right? Early on at lines 20 or so. So now at the castle, they feasted within the grand high-roof palace. All the kin and clansmen of Menelaus in his glory, Kleos, reveling warmly here as in their midst, an inspired bard sang. So notice, we've got a lot in the first 4 books. We got lots of feasting, eating. We got lots of bards, poets singing. We have lots of reflecting back to the time of the fall of Troy and all of that. And through them, a pair of trombones danced and sprang, whirling and leaping handsprings, leading on the dance. So in other words, everything in Menelaus' castle is about joy, fun, dancing, the youth, all of that. So as the 2 young kids show up, obviously they're very excited to see all of this, right? Menelaus has a servant, Etonus, who will actually ask Menelaus, what are your thoughts about these strangers? And Menelaus will respond in lines 35, what do you mean, what are we going to do with these strangers? Never a fool before, Etonus, you were, right? Now seeing you babbling like a child. Just think of all the hospitality, Xenia, we enjoyed at the hands of other men before we made it home. God save us from such hard treks in years to come. Quick, unhitch their team, bring them in, and let's feed them. So in other words, Xenia is practiced again. So follow it. Xenia on the island of Ithaca is only practiced by Telemachus towards Athena, who is, of course, dressed up like Mentis, okay? Xenia on Nestor's island at Pylos is very much in form, and, of course, here as well with Menelaus. Finally, at the end of their food, at line 80, Telemachus will whisper to Pisistratus, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. He says, I'm struck with wonder, my eyes dazzle, he says. And all of a sudden, Menelaus, overhearing, says, hey, he says at line 85, 86, 87, no man alive could rival Zeus, because Telemachus says, this must be what Mount Olympus looks like, and Zeus is, where Zeus lives. And he says, no man alive could rival Zeus, dear boys, with his everlasting palace and possessions. But among men, I must say, few if any could rival me in riches. Believe me, much I suffered. This sounding very much like Odysseus. Now, let's point out the irony of this. Menelaus goes to Troy to get his wife back. To get his wife back means that the city of Troy must fall. Once the city of Troy falls, all of the Scooby snacks, Team A as we called it in our Iliad lectures, all that gold and everything else inside of the city, guess what? Well, most of it ends up going to Menelaus, right? So in other words, there's a reason why he's got so much Scooby snacks, right? But he says, to get it I suffered. Many a mile I rove to haul such treasures home in my ships, right? In other words, this was a major challenge, right? And he begins to then tell the story of how everything happened the way that it happened. He says, I got a lot of money, but I don't have a lot of joy because my brother got killed in his homecoming. And he says at line 111, 112, still much as I weep for all my men, grieving sorely, time and again, sitting here in the royal halls, now indulging myself in tears, now brushing tears away. The grief that numbs the spirit gluts quickly. For none of all those comrades, pained as I am, do I grieve as much for one. That man who makes sleep hateful, even food, as I pour over his memory. No one, no Achaean labored hard as Odysseus labored, or achieved so much. And how did his struggles end? In suffering for that man, for me, in relentless heartbreaking grief, for him, lost and gone, so long now, dead or alive, who knows? Note the irony. Telemachus hasn't yet told him that he is the son of Odysseus. And yet, notice Menelaus is taking him there, right? And we're told, now to finish, how they must mourn him too. Laertes, the old man. We know about Laertes, and of course he's completely withdrawn, right, from anything going on Ithaca now. And self-possessed Penelope. Telemachus as well, the boy left a babe in arms at home. Such memories stirred, we're told, in the young prince, Telemachus. A deep desire to grieve for Odysseus. Tears streamed down his cheeks. When all of a sudden, Helen shows up. While Menelaus is debating in his mind. Helen, now we're at lines 135 or so. This is some of the most amazing passages in all of the Odyssey. Here is Helen, the one who's given some of the last words of the Iliad, the one who is the reason for all of the fighting that happened in Troy. We only hear from Helen a few times in the Iliad, but every time she speaks, it is fascinating stuff. Talking, for example, to Priam on the walls and explaining who is who and wondering where her two brothers are. Talking to Paris after he comes back from being wounded by Menelaus and saying, I wish that you had been killed by my husband. I wish that this thing would all end with your death. Why don't you have enough courage to go out there and show your face? Ending in the Iliad with her saying about Hector, he was the kindest person to me. While other people slung insults at me, he was sweet to me. Now, we're 10 years later, almost 10 years later, after that moment, at the fall of Hector. Soon it would be the fall of Troy. And here it is now, Helen emerging, we're told, coming with her entourage. So here we go at line 135 and following. Helen emerged from her scented lofty chamber. By the way, Penelope also lives up top in a chamber up top. So in other words, notice they come down, right, into the halls or whatever, right? Striking as Artemis with her golden shafts, and a train of women followed. In some ways, this is like Helen's Aristeia, as we use that term, right? In other words, all of her entourage. She has all these people that bring all this stuff with her, right? She's got tubs of bathing tubs in silver. She's got all this stuff. She was given all kinds of gifts over the course of her journey, we are told, right? Helen now, finally when she gets seated, she has stuff there ready to yarn, ready to begin her weaving, which is, of course, insignificant. So the first time we saw Helen in the Iliad, she was weaving, right? We're told, the eye of the poet is amazing. Helen, we're told at line 150, leaned back in her chair, a stool beneath her feet, pressed her husband at once for each detail. Do we know, my lord Menelaus, who our visitors claim to be, our welcome new arrivals? Right or wrong, what can I say? My heart tells me to come right out and say, I've never seen such a likeness, neither in man or woman. I'm amazed at the sight. To the life, he's like the son of great Odysseus. Surely he's Telemachus, the boy, that hero left a babe in arms at home, when all you Achaeans fought at Troy, launching your headlong battles just for my sake, shameless whore that I was. Now this shocks students when they read this line, unless they've read the Iliad. If they've read the Iliad, they know that this kind of self-effacing language is what Helen is given by the poet Homer to always speak about herself. She is aware she is beautiful. She is aware that her beauty led Paris to attract her away. She's also always going to blame that, by the way, on the goddess Aphrodite, as we will hear, right? my dear, Menelaus will say. Right? Now that you mention it, I see the likeness too. Odysseus' feet were like the boy's, his hands as well, his glancing eyes, his head, the fine shock of hair. We're going to say that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree when we talk about themes messages, and here it is, right? Wow, you're right, he does look just like Odysseus. Yes, and just now as I was talking about Odysseus remembering how he struggled and suffered all for me, a flood of tears came streaming down his face, and he clutched his purple robe before his eyes. A gesture, right, that we will see a number of times. Pisistratus is the one who will say, right, this is in fact the son of Odysseus, and he asks for Telemachus. So Pisistratus will ask, where is Odysseus? Where has he gone? Now that his father's gone, we've got these suitors back home that are doing all kinds of nasties, right? Menelaus will respond at line 185. Wonderful, he says, the son of my dearest friend here in my own house, the man who performed 100 feats of arms for me, in other words, getting my wife back. And I swore that when he came home, Menelaus says, I'd even give him a city. I owe him everything. Of course, this is the point. Troy would not have fallen if it hadn't been for Odysseus and his horse, right? We'll get to that one in a moment. He says, in fact, that the gods are jealous of Odysseus and all that he's done. There is this desire to grieve. They all start kind of crying, remembering their losses. And Pisistratus will in fact speak, and he will say, I have a brother of my own among the dead. In other words, I too lost at Troy. And hardly the poorest soldier in our ranks. You probably knew him. The ironies are amazing here. I never met him, never saw him myself, but they say he outdid our best. Antilochus, lightning on his feet, in every inch a fighter. Well, of course, we know about this because in Iliad 23, you'll remember it's Antilochus who robs Menelaus of the prize in the chariot race. And Menelaus is so upset about it, and it's Antilochus, the son of Nestor, the brother of Pisistratus, who will say, you know what, I'm young, I'm impetuous, please forgive, and in fact, I'll give you the Scooby Snack gift, team me back, and it will be, you'll remember that Menelaus says, no, that's fine. In other words, oh yes, Menelaus definitely knows, right? And he immediately, Menelaus says it, oh yeah, I know who your family is. You come from amazing stock. Again, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? And then we have this very interesting moment at line 244. Zeus's daughter Helen, Helen is referred to constantly as having the relationship to Zeus. We don't see that commented on as much in the Iliad as we do here, okay? Giving Helen even more power. The reason why Samuel Butler argued, among other things, that maybe a woman wrote the Odyssey is because there are so many moments where women take central kind of importance in these books. Helen thought of something else to do. Into the mixing bowl from which they drank with her wine, she slipped a drug. Heart's ease, dissolving anger, magic to make us all forget our pains. So we're told cunning drugs at line 251. The poet is again playing the game that anytime women get involved with men need to be careful because women are so cunning. Think about Penelope, unweaving and weaving, her robe so she doesn't have to marry for 3 years, right? We then are told that Helen, when she was in Egypt, picked up these herbs, these drugs, and then once they're drugs, so that they don't feel any more pain or sorrow, at line 264, Helen is ready to tell her story about Odysseus. So we're going to have two reflective stories. For your notes, this is what's about to happen. We're going to have two reflective stories of Odysseus. The first one is Helen's, and there's some interesting stuff that we're going to learn about Helen and Menelaus, and Odysseus, of course, but certainly Helen. She says, at line 264, My royal king Menelaus, welcome guest here, sons of the great as well. Zeus can present us times of joy and times of grief in turn. And we immediately, of course, think of Achilles and his reference in Iliad 24 to the idea that Zeus has in Mount Olympus 2 huge jars. One jar of blessings, one jar of curses, and the human experience is to have some of both, right? We never want to have just curses, and although we would long to have all just blessings, that's only for the gods, right? All lies within Zeus's power, she continues. So come, let's sit back in the palace now, dine and warm our hearts with the old stories. And we immediately think of Achilles strumming his harp in Iliad 9, and telling stories of fallen heroes. I will tell something, she says, something perfect for the occasion. Surely I can't describe or even list them all, the exploits crowding fearless Odysseus' record. But what a feat that hero dared, carried off in the land of Troy, where you Achaeans suffered. Notice it's you Achaeans suffered, not Helen. I didn't suffer, you Achaeans. And we're told Odysseus dresses up as a spy, incognito, setting us all up for what's about to happen at the end of the Iliad, right? This is brilliant poetry. The way that Helen in the Odyssey is telling a story from way back when at the walls of Troy, which will completely set us up for what Odysseus is going to be doing at the very end to jack those suitors, right? But immediately she says, I could tell it was Odysseus. I knew this beggar was Odysseus. She says, I brought him into my castle. I bathed him. We know this is something that happens again and again, but it's just kind of interesting. I bathed him. Odysseus revealed his strategy to me, she says. And she says at line 290 that when he left, she says the rest of the Trojan women shrilled their grief, because obviously lots and lots of Trojan women were losing their men. Right? We know about this from our study of the Iliad. She says, not I. My heart leapt up. We think about the lines that we study from Wordsworth's little poem, my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. My heart leapt up. I got happy. My heart had changed by now. In other words, at the end of the Trojan experience, at the end of 10 years, she says, my heart had changed. I yearned to sail back home again. In other words, I needed to have my Odyssey. I was done with being with the Trojans. I grieved too late for the madness Aphrodite sent to me, luring me there. So notice, Helen plays the same game. The blame game comes up. Blame the gods, right? Aphrodite's to blame because she's the goddess of love and beauty, and it was madness, right? Luring me there, far from my dear land, forsaking my own child, that is Hermione, right? My bridal bed, my husband too. You can imagine she looks over at Menelaus, a man who lacked for neither brains nor beauty.